Hello, everyone. My name is Heidi Beirich. I'm the co-founder of the Global Project Against Hate and Extremism, and along with my colleague here, Jessica González, a co-chair and a co-founder of Change the Terms, a coalition of dozens of civil rights groups that have been working on issues related to hateful online content since, I guess, 2018, 2017, long time at this work. Our topic today is bad platforms, which I think is horrifically timely after what we just saw this past weekend in Buffalo, where what seemed to be a quick move by the company Twitch to remove this horrific video turned out not to be such a wonderful situation, with Facebook allowing the shooter's video to proliferate more than 1 million times, stills found on Twitter. And these are all companies that are part of the Global Internet Forum for Counterterrorism, so in theory, for some time now, have had a hashing system to track that kind of information. And Discord, also a member of the GIFCT, is where the attack was basically laid out for everybody to find. Google Drive is where his document was hosted. So this is an important topic to be talking about in the wake of this weekend's tragedy. So with that, I will hand it to Jessica.
Thank you, Heidi. Well, we certainly had a sobering morning. I've been working on anti-hate work since we were doing anti-hate on the radio work. And yet today we're at a really tough moment. And I will say, the people who are sitting here at this table, despite all this, give me great hope. We have some of the smartest thinkers in the United States in terms of data science, campaign, organizing, and policy. So I'm really pleased to introduce right here Angelo Carusone from Media Matters. We have Sophie Zheng, who is a data scientist and a Facebook whistleblower. We have Dr. Marianne Franks, a professor at the University of Miami, and my friend Rashad Robinson down there at the end, who is the CEO of Color of Change.
So I'm going to ask the first question. It's going to be directed to Rashad. And if you want to add, Rashad, thoughts about what happened this weekend, that'd also be really helpful. So there's overwhelming evidence that structures and design choices of the social media platforms, search engines, are failing and they're harming users. We've heard all about that all today. This has been brought to the attention of big tech through many forums, Color of Change work, obviously, Rashad personally doing outreach, through the Black Lives Matter movement in various ways. And we're interested in hearing about the insights you can provide about how you've worked to negotiate, for example, with the leadership, Zuckerberg or Sandberg, directly at Facebook, or any other similar examples you want to bring up, and what's been successful, what hasn't. And if you have any thoughts on the current regulatory environment here in the US, or what needs to be done.
Well, first of all, well, thank you all. It's great to be with you all here. And that was such an easy question, no multiple parts or anything, so I appreciate me getting started with that. I do want to start off by saying something about racial terror and racial violence, and the ways in which it is used to both send a very clear message about hierarchy in this country, and to stifle and silence our ability to fight for a better tomorrow. The ways in which it is deployed, and the confluence of the ways in which technology and sort of this new era we're in only supercharge it is obviously why Color of Change is in this work. I don't, though, want us to think that just because we are now seeing these things in different ways and we are experiencing them on our screens that we just don't have a history structured around racial violence in this country against black people, against indigenous people, against immigrants, and that is sort of baked in. And so then when you add unaccountable tools and unaccountable technology, it only sort of exacerbates that and gives more energy to animate more to happen. So I think that's important. The question about the technology platforms, I think, is an important one because I think we just have to get very clear that self-regulated companies are unregulated companies. And as much as we have done our best to go back and forth with the big tech platforms, we have, Jessica and I have been part of boycotts of these platforms. I have spent a lot of personal time going back and forth, meetings, sitting across the table, actually winning things out the meeting that we were able to announce and changes that they said they were going to make, only to watch when powerful people broke the four corners of those rules, whether it be Donald Trump or someone else, they decide whether or not they're going to enforce it, is an example of sort of the state that we're in, where we can't be in a place where we're begging billionaires to protect our civil rights, or protect our human rights, and hoping that they will do that over the interest of growth and profit. And so the idea that we can negotiate in ways that are actually going to be real, I think we have to just be very realistic about the limitations. Now, in the march towards an election or the march towards a census, sometimes you have to do the best you possibly can to try to get some rules. And I've sat across from Mark Zuckerberg in a room while we were trying to get him to agree to some new rules around the suppression of the census that was happening on his platform. And he, in that conversation, brought up a young, undocumented woman that he was mentoring in East Palo Alto, and used her story of being uncomfortable about what happened around DACA as a way to say, well, I don't want to prevent her from speaking out against the census on my platform. And I was wondering what other policies he runs by her before he makes them, and if he was paying her for her expertise. We could probably think of an answer to that, but I say that to say that if she wasn't putting tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars behind her post, her friends probably wouldn't even see the post, or all of her friends wouldn't see the post. And so the sort of the ways in which every solution becomes problematized by a platform that is not actually interested in solutions. And so here's what we have to recognize as our path forward, that we have to hold the line between real solutions and fake solutions. It's not enough to say regulation, because they will say that they are for regulation. And then, just like every other industry, will then put forward regulations that actually suit their interest. I have been in a number of meetings and engagements with researchers sponsored and funded by the platforms right now who are driving a narrative about that this is a demand-side problem, and that people want this kind of content, and if we can't cut them off from the things that they want, as if that would be sort of the thing we said about food deserts in this country, or guns, or anything else. And so then the final thing I'll just say about holding the line between real solutions and fake solutions, and tying it back to Buffalo, is that I fundamentally believe, particularly in the United States, that racial justice is our strongest force multiplier to win. And what do I mean by that? I mean that racial justice is not only one of the most powerful forces we have in this country to actually mobilize people to action. Think about the summer of 2020 in this country, when so much was happening, and many people thought the best we could do in terms of activism was clap outside of windows or uplift investigating journalism. It was racial justice that drove people to the streets, made people raise their voice, led to upticks in voter registration. It was multiracial coalitions of people that came together and said enough is enough and started demanding more. And so we actually have to fuel and engage and empower a base, because we will always lose in the back rooms if we don't have people lined up at the front door. And the final thing about racial justice is that it's not just our most powerful force multiplier to actually get people to action. It is also the most powerful lens for us to actually use to determine if our solutions are real. because the people most impacted by these problems are the people who have been traditionally targeted, exploited, and harmed by so many other systems in this country. These are not vulnerable communities. These are targeted communities. These are not weak communities. These are communities that have shown some of the most resilience under so many attacks for generations upon generations and are still here. And so the idea of racial justice, not just as an outcome, not just as charity, but racial justice as strategy has to be part of how we actually do this work. If we both want to win and get more people invested in holding folks accountable, and if we want to have the correct lens by which to judge if our solutions actually meet the bar to be real solutions that impact our society in the ways that we want it to.
All right, wow. Thank you, Rashad. Thank you so much for all your incredible work. And I couldn't agree more that self-regulation means no regulation. We must do better than that. And as you were talking, I was thinking of that one meeting that we had when we were running Stop Hate for Profit. I forgot to introduce myself because I was so excited about, I'm Jessica González. I'm the co-CEO of Free Press. I work a lot with these folks to hold tech companies accountable. But I was thinking about that meeting, Rashad, and it was a Zoom meeting because it was already in pandemic times, right after the George Floyd protests. And we were asking Mark Zuckerberg, with Sheryl Sandberg in the background, clearly feeding him lines, right? We were asking him, how in the world did you decide not to take down the shooting and looting post? And he gave us some ridiculous answer. And what we learned from that experience, right? And Stop Hate for Profit, Mark Zuckerberg lost $7 billion in a day. The company lost $45 billion in market capitalization in a week. Okay, it was a hit. This guy's still really wildly rich, but it was a hit that made them pick their heads up a little bit. But even with all that pressure, we got some concessions, but it made it so clear that we need more. We need the government oversight to come and really hold these companies accountable. The other thing we learned, and I'm going to come to you in a second, Sophie, is that through a series of conversations, not just with Meta, but with Twitter, with YouTube, and with other platforms that Heidi and I did through the Change the Terms Coalition, is that they were not being honest with us. No one's surprised in this room. I didn't hear a big, like, we're not shocked, right? But we didn't have the receipts. And so when people like Sophie came out and revealed the details of what was happening, it was a critically important piece of transparency because it helped us confirm our suspicions and what we thought we saw were happening in light of like just a deep gaslighting campaign from these companies. So Sophie, we know there's clear information asymmetry and power imbalance existing between big tech, civil society, and government. We've learned a lot about the structural failures of big tech, the types of engineering, commercial, and political decisions that are being made at a corporate level behind closed doors, and your why, one of the reasons why we understand that more deeply. Can you walk us through your experience? What steps did you take to raise the concerns about electoral manipulation in Honduras, arising from inauthentic accounts at Facebook, and how long did it take for that process to run?
Absolutely, and thank you very much. And just to check, my mic is on, right?
You sound great.
Like it. Okay, so just quickly to back up. So the subject of this conference is mostly online harms and misinformation. I worked personally on inauthentic accounts. They sound similar to a lot of people, but they're actually different subjects. For instance, if someone says the moon is made out of cheese, this is misinformation. It does not matter who says it. You could be a prime minister. You could be a 10-year-old child in a basement. It's still misinformation. On the other hand, inauthentic accounts depends on who says it and not what is being said. If I set up 10,000 fake accounts to say the moon is made out of rock, there's nothing wrong with this statement. The moon is made out of rock, but I am using fake accounts to do this and to drown out the voices of other people. With misinformation and hate speech, there are real questions about where to draw the line, about what should be taken down because freedom of speech. But in comparison, there is no real controversy about inauthentic accounts. No one serious is defending their use, and taking them down is actually necessary to protect freedom of speech, just like it's necessary to stop ballot box stuffing in order to protect the sanctity of the vote, to stop the votes of real people from being drowned out. That was why I chose to work on it in the first place, because I didn't have to worry about whether I was doing the right thing. And so anyways, this was in the summer of 2018. I was very young and naive. I'm still young and naive, but perhaps a bit less so. And so I was very young and idealistic. They found that they caught the president of Honduras red-handed. He and his employees were using an operation of thousands of fake assets that were being pretending to be Honduran citizens that were actually fake assets set up by the president's employees. Usually in these sorts of cases, you want to be careful to make sure you're accusing the right person. But in this case, they didn't even bother to hide. It was as if the police investigated someone for murder, and they found out that someone had signed their names in their own fingerprints with the blood of the victim. It was so ludicrous, I didn't believe it at the time. And again, I was very young and naive. I thought I would hand it over to the right people. They would take care of it. I could get back to my actual job, because all this is work I was doing in my free time. Instead, it was the start of a two-year Sisyphean ordeal. Like I talked to different teams across Facebook, all of which agreed that this was terrible, and none of which agreed it was actually their problem. Like, for instance, in the United States, tragically, we have many mass shootings. After every mass shooting, absolutely no one is defending mass shootings. Rather, people disagree. What is the correct solution? Perhaps the correct solution is more guns. An armed society is a polite society. Perhaps the correct solution is to arm the teachers. Perhaps the correct solution is to have gun control. And so in the end, even though everyone agrees that this is a terrible problem, the only thing that happens are thoughts and prayers. I took this up to everyone, up to and including Guy Rosen, who's the vice president of integrity at Facebook. And I want to note how unusual this is, because I was a low-level employee, one level above a new hire out of college, out of grad school, that is. Like, imagine if an army sergeant personally briefed Kamala Harris on something. That would be unthinkable. It would only happen if there was literally no one more important to do it. And that's essentially what happened in my case. And eventually I figured out that the best way to get action was not to go through the proper pathways and talking to people within Facebook, but rather by making complaints publicly within the company, such as that it would then go viral on the company messaging boards, and thus convince company employees that there was a problem, because Facebook employees are human and need to sleep at night like everyone else. If you hire a lot of young, impressionable 20-somethings on the promise that they're making the world a better place, some of them will actually believe you. And so eventually I was able to get Facebook to take it down almost a year later. They tried to come back almost immediately afterwards. I was there to catch them and stop them. I thought of it as a victory at the time. Later I found out that they came back the next week using a different method, and I was unable to get Facebook to take that down. It became like whack-a-mole. In Azerbaijan, it took more than a year. When Facebook does its takedowns for coordinated inauthentic behavior, what it does is that it removes the fake accounts, and then it puts out a public announcement saying, these people did it, they shouldn't do it again. The idea is to embarrass the perpetrators in the eyes of the world. The president of Honduras who did this, he is currently in New York City, where he was extradited to face trial for smuggling drugs to the United States in order to finance his presidential campaign. I don't think he's quite worried about the embarrassment caused by this episode in comparison. Like the government of Azerbaijan, in 2013, they managed to accidentally release election results a day before the actual election. Imagine if the punishment for robbing a bank were to confiscate the bank robbery tools and put up a public notice. This person robbed a bank, they shouldn't do it again. This would be wholly insufficient to solve the problem. The point of robbing the bank is to make money, and it's been spent, you can't take it away. Ultimately, I think it's important to remember that Facebook is a company. Its goal is to make money, and to the extent that it cares about protecting democracy, it's more because other people care about protecting democracy, and that can influence Facebook's bottom line. We don't expect Philip Morris to have a division that reimburses Medicare every time someone gets sick with lung cancer. If we don't expect them to have a division that makes cigarettes less addictive either. I mean, if they did have such a division, that would not be a very effective division, quite frankly. And I mean, it is to Facebook's credit that they have a division that's focused on making the platform less harmful. But like Philip Morris Tobacco's less addictive division, this division is frankly not very effective and gets hamstringed by leadership. Because ultimately, Mark Zuckerberg is never going to change Facebook unless you force him to do so.
Thank you so much, Sophie.
Yeah, Sophie, it's really an incredible tale. That it would take a year to remove stuff that affects elections is, appalling and doesn't bode well for here either. So, Dr. Marianne Franks, next question is for you. From these experiences that you've heard and the harms that have already been discussed by our speakers, it's clear that we don't, and this is also a topic that's been talked about all day today here as well. It's clear that the law that we have right now, the frameworks that we have, they're not doing anything. And as Rashad said, self-regulation is essentially no regulation. And we don't have a way to incentivize big tech to behave morally, because why would they, right? This is about money. So could you talk maybe a little bit about your research and your work around what needs to happen to sort of shift the behavior of big tech to get the reforms, that we need? Talk a little bit about Section 230, how that relates to free speech and constitutional protections, privacy, and so on.
It's both my favorite and my least favorite topic. So I'll be happy to talk about that. So I'll say a little bit about the organization that I work with, which is called the Cyber Civil Rights Initiative, to point out and to highlight the frame that I think about when thinking about these issues, which is very much a civil rights approach. That what part of the problem is, whether it's a First Amendment free speech issue or a Section 230 issue, or the company saying, give the people what they want, so much of what happens around this debate is misunderstanding or deliberate misunderstandings or misperceptions of what freedom of speech is and what civil rights are. And so the focus that we try to bring to these issues is to say, as Rashad was saying, that when you let unfettered incendiary threats, agendas of harassment and hatred and incitement to violence, when you let that flourish unchecked, when you monetize it, when you let people monetize it, you silence other people. So there's no sense in which one can honestly say that is a free speech protective position. It means you want freedom of speech for people who want to hurt other people, and you want those other targeted communities to be silenced and for their speech to be discounted or dismissed or excluded. So we very much try to put the focus on saying, here are what the civil rights implications are of inaction. And we focus not just on racial issues, but also on gender issues, sexual exploitation issues. A lot of our work is focused on what is sometimes referred to as revenge porn, also known as non-consensual pornography or image-based sexual abuse. So when we talk about the incentives, as many people have mentioned today, there are so many good efforts being made by nonprofits, by legislators, by policymakers about transparency, about tools, all the things that these companies can do. And let's be frank about how they have in fact used nonprofits and unpaid labor of those nonprofits to get better. They have outsourced their problems to nonprofits that are struggling for funds. And they've done that, and they've done it when it actually suits them in the public relations sphere to do so. So they can't really take credit for the modest gains that they have made, because some have been made. There have been some victories that have been made. Nearly all of them can be traced back to a nonprofit or an activist or someone else outside of the company who was pushing for the change, or inside the company trying to blow the whistle. So with that in mind, what do we do? What do we do about the fact that this is all up to the kind of largesse of billionaires? Part of the problem in the United States is going to be the Section 230 problem. There's no way around it. There are, of course, things that can be done outside of reforming Section 230, including enforcing and in times creating federal criminal legislation that does not apply for Section 230. There's a lot of things that the FTC could do. There are a lot of things that we could do in terms of trying to think more broadly about what an unfair and deceptive practice is, including maybe forcing social media companies to charge subscription fees so that they don't keep thinking they're getting something for free, because none of it is free. But Section 230 stands large over this problem because it essentially tells these companies, yeah, do all of those things that cost money and are going to hurt your bottom line, or don't. It doesn't matter. Because if in fact you do nothing, if in fact you monetize and you profit from terrible content that is illegal or unlawful or gets people killed, if you do all of that, no one's going to be able to sue you. So why bother, right? This is what companies have to think about. Do more transparency, be better about this, respect people's privacy. At the end of the day, if you don't change Section 230, effectively you're saying to the companies, do this or don't, just as you feel. So what is the problem? Section 230 has two major parts. Really important to keep this in mind. And I want to underscore that because we've seen some really recent terrible attempts to answer the question, what should you do about Section 230 and big tech, namely Texas. All right. I could elaborate, but you all know what I mean. The problem with Section 230 is not a problem that every part of Section 230 has. Section 230 first part says you can't treat people as the publisher or speaker of other people's information. That's the problematic section. The part that's actually pretty good and actually does comport with the First Amendment is the second part that says, hey, to the extent that you take things down, you can't get in trouble for that. That's the genuine part of the law that actually is a good Samaritan law. It's the part that says if you try to help someone when you didn't have a legal obligation to do so, and you mess up, you didn't do it perfectly, you might have done something to the person unintentionally, you're not going to get sued. There is a piece of Section 230 that does that, and we need to leave it alone. The problem is going to be Section C1, the part that says you're basically off the hook if someone else on the platform did it. And that has to be changed because it really is saying, if you're going to go back to the Good Samaritan analogy, we all know about the parable, right? So you've got the person who was set upon by robbers, left in a ditch for dead, beaten, all of his money has been stolen, and you've got these two people who are supposedly religious and moral people who walk by and do nothing because it's not their problem. And then you've got the person who comes along and says, I feel sorry for this person. I'm going to tend to his wounds, and I am going to give him new clothes, and I'm going to give him money. Now imagine that what really Section 230 is doing by saying you're not responsible for things that you in fact have created or profit from. It's like saying, you, Good Samaritan, get to have a benefit, but so do you, the two people who passed by and did nothing, and so do you, robbers who beat the guy to begin with and took his money. And that can no longer be allowed to stand. And there's a fairly simple way of trying to affect this. There are two major problems with Section 230 that could be fixed. One is this free speech fetishism part. And that is the part where it says any information provided by another content provider. This is the strangest euphemism one can think of, especially if what you mean to say is something supported by the First Amendment, and people do like to treat the Section 230 and the First Amendment as if they were interchangeable. They're not. And that problem is that now companies are able to apply this preemptive immunity shield, not just when it comes to speech, and not just when it comes to speech that's actually protected by the First Amendment, which despite the misinformation about the First Amendment that exists, is not everything. There are lots of things that you can't actually say or that you can prohibit, restrict, or punish in many ways. So the amount of speech that's actually protected by the First Amendment is not what is captured by the word information. We need to get rid of the word information and put the word speech there, and note that it is only going to apply to speech acts that are plausibly protected by the First Amendment. The second thing we have to do with Section 230 is remove the immunity shield for any entity that acts with deliberate indifference to unlawful content or conduct. And this is just reminding ourselves how the law works everywhere else except online. The people who own this particular spot, right, this private spot, if there were known to be something, I don't know, in the middle of the floor, somebody had spilled something, and it's really slippery, and everybody can see that if someone slips on that, they're going to hurt themselves. And the person who owns this place or is responsible for managing this place sees it and just says, yeah, I don't feel like doing anything about it. And then someone slips and in fact falls, then there's liability. It's not because you intended for that person to fall. It's not because you necessarily will profit from it, but you made a choice to be deliberately indifferent to something you could have easily addressed. And so Section 230 should be just brought into line with basically what is the law essentially everywhere else except online. So as I say, those are the things that we really have to address if we're going to talk about this larger interest of incentives, because as whistleblowers have shown us, as people from the inside now have documented for us, the kinds of content that these companies are naturally going to want to promote is the most contentious, most provocative, most harmful, high engagement as the euphemism goes, because that is what will get them profit. And if we're going to affect that incentive structure, we have to say it's not that profitable. And there are multiple ways of doing that and holding companies accountable. But one really important democratic American way of doing it is letting people sue when they've been harmed. Does that mean that the companies will suddenly become liable for every bad thing that a person does online? Of course not, because that's not how lawsuits work. What it means is that the courtroom door is not closed to someone who has a plausible claim of saying that there's a causal connection between what this platform knew about and let happen and harm that actually ultimately resulted. And it shouldn't be this hard. This deference and this preference that we've had for the tech industry has to end if we want to care about the kinds of issues that I think everybody in this room cares about and that lead directly to issues like the Buffalo shooting video. Because we all know this by now. This is not the first time this has happened. Facebook has been called to account before about how, there are live stream rapes and murders and assaults, and Facebook says, what? We never thought someone would use the tool this way. Of course you thought about it, or if you didn't, you have no business running a business. Live streaming is what it is. It means that you cannot simply answer the problem by saying, more people needed to have flagged it earlier. And as someone else pointed out before, even Twitch, which got to it within 2 minutes, which is amazing actually, it's not fast enough because live streaming by its very nature means that people are going to use it to live stream assaults. They have ever since live streaming became a thing on social media. And the answer can't be for the public to do more or to hire more content moderators and pay them basically nothing and give them no mental health support for what they're looking at for however many hours a day. All of those things have to stop. So if we actually want to get at the heart of this, and noting too that the Buffalo shooting is not just about online. Of course, it's an echo of the mainstream media. It's an echo of, frankly, the Republican Party platform at this point. But if you're going to have to think about what it means to have a medium that encourages people to perform, the Buffalo Shooters Manifesto says, I thought about which platform to put this on, and I chose Twitch because somebody else had chosen Twitch before. And essentially because it's like a video game, right, to this person, and says, everybody can access this in real time, whereas Facebook, if I put it on some other platform, people might have to have an account. I want maximum audience for what I'm doing. In other words, the platform itself, the medium itself, is becoming part of the incentive and part of the performance. And this is not new. We know this now. We've known it, frankly, since the 1980s when white supremacists in the United States were getting online and getting really excited about the potential that the world of the internet had for them to unite white supremacists everywhere. And the idea that we didn't know in 1996 when Section 230 was written about these problems, some of us did know, and some people were talking about it, and yet they were ignored.
Wow. Thank you so much, Marianne. Really appreciate that take. And I really appreciate how you got deeper into the Section 230 debate than we often see. We've heard a lot of calls for a straight repeal, and I think it's critically important that we take a really nuanced approach to this because, as you mentioned, there are parts that are important that actually incentivize takedown. So I really appreciate you pulling the hood off of that one. I'm gonna tee up the next question for the whole panel, but we're gonna start with you, Angelo. So our hosts here today, CCDH, have done a ton of excellent research and reporting showing systemic failures of complaint pathways for harmful content and how big tech has been unresponsive to reports of non-compliant content. Obviously, Media Matters for America, tracks right-wing activity, also does a fair bit of its own tracking of this as well. So can you tell us, in your view, what the minimum criteria or minimum features should be in a complaint system? What other consumer protections do you think companies need to build into their platforms and search engines? Understanding that, yes, we need regulation and legislation, but that also the tech platforms have a responsibility to make changes as well.
That's great. Thank you, man. Thank you for being. I'm really happy to be here. One thing before I answer that specifically, I do want to take a step back because I do think it's important to note is that, if we're relying on reports as the front line or even a primary vehicle for solving this problem, we're in big trouble. Even talking about it makes me nervous sometimes, and here's why: it takes the onus off the platforms. It is not users' responsibilities to moderate this stuff. The majority of the problem, there were always going to be edge cases. And even if we really care about getting the most optimal system for moderation, if we don't deal with the fundamental role that the platforms have themselves, we'll never be able to put together a scheme that is reliable enough. There'll be too much problems to solve. So I actually think they do go hand in hand. So I would just point out at the top that we always have to keep the onus on the platforms. That's really important. That is the bulk of the problems, and it's not an optimal reporting system, but there's a lot that can be done there, especially as you pointed out, the consumer protection lane, and so that's the first thing. So what I would just emphasize is that there's two other points here, and then I'll get into the specific thing. One is that when we talk about platforms, I like to break it up into two different buckets, right? Because there are other platforms that are emerging now that are not like Facebook and Twitter, that are sort of the feature is the bug. The design is to be as terrible as possible. They don't care about their commenting system or their reporting system or their structures. They're simply designed to actually intensify online harms and misinformation. That's their goals. Rumble. Gab doesn't even rely on the App Store or advertising. It's literally a haven for white supremacists, white nationalists, and the worst possible people. But that said, they interact with the mainstream platforms. They need them. They need them to recruit. They need them to grow. They need them to distribute their content. They need them to operationalize the harms that they're trying to do. So that's going to matter in the context of my question. So one is we always have to, when we talk about platforms, keep in mind there's the ones that are the big ones that are going to be more responsive to this kind of stuff because there's pressure points, and then there's ones that they're not. So when we're talking about that second group, we should think about how they interplay with the main platforms, because that's going to help us design optimal solutions, especially as it relates to this reporting question. And then the other thing is that I would just point out is to think about the pressure points, advertisers and the app stores. And when Heidi was talking earlier about the shooting in Buffalo and the live streaming, and the doctor had sort of referenced that too, it feels unsolvable at first, but then think about it in a different context. Think about it like if the most recent Marvel movie was uploaded to Facebook, how long do you think it would last? Do you think it would last for 2 minutes? Because I'm sure it won't. And that's because they put in sufficient protections on the front end in terms of hashing, in terms of artificial intelligence to analyze things. You don't think they can have AI that detects guns and certain types of behaviors during live streams to flag it for a human to review it within 30 seconds? Of course they could. Of course they could. I mean, absolutely. So, and they certainly make sure they put those protections in place when it comes to making sure the latest Marvel movie doesn't leak. That is both a critique but also some hope, because it demonstrates that these problems can in fact be solved. And so when I point to the app stores or the advertisers, they're the fulcrum here. They can really drive a lot of this. It was the industry that required that type of proactive and preventive work that was nimble and adaptable and dynamic. It's going to be the industry that ultimately forces the platforms outside of regulation to really put in place the kind of features that are required. And that's where the consumers come in. So I wanted to just start at the top, because I always hate to make it seem like it's the user's problem when in fact it is the platform's problem. That said, so if we're thinking about the comments themselves, the truth is, one, they have to have better front-end work so that the things are a little bit better, so that they're not getting an avalanche. But I think the features that are probably most effective here and that are needed are a couple. One is that is to think about I'll give a couple examples. One is that their rules, for the most part, are pretty consistent across the board, right? We're not going to have hateful symbols. We're not going to have this. We're not going to. Okay, fine. What they don't do is adapt them to reality. They don't adapt them to address the fact that bad actors are always adjusting. They're always changing. So one example we found, and it fits directly within this reporting feature, is we found a network of Instagram accounts that were basically working together in order to promote all kinds of hateful content. And the way they got around Instagram's anti-hate rules is literally the bio of the account was a pro-Israel, pro-Jewish account. That was it. That was the bio of the account. Wow. Okay. And celebrating Jewish contributions was the secondary descriptor. Oh, okay, sounds nice. And what they did is all they did was post things that lined up with anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, right? Certain stats, some of it being misinformation about how much Jews controlled the media, or certain, say, involvement in funding caravans, all sorts of stuff, right? And the comment features were turned off. So the account grew rapidly. And what it was sort of a feeder for a secondary set of accounts on Instagram that would then take that content and comment on it. So they were literally evading the most basic rules that Instagram had because they defined themselves as celebrating instead of attacking. So all these accounts were reported to Instagram. None of them got zapped for violating Instagram's terms of service. Not a single one. They should have. The intention was very, very clear. The goal was to promote. It was to basically put into the ecosystem that initial ingredients for the types of hateful responses that you'd get a secondary network of Instagram accounts that would use that to comment. So now you're in free speech territory. They're just commenting. And those accounts, of course, had very robust followings. And the goal really was to create comment systems to let people engage on those accounts that were commenting on the comments. So the comment threads there were the worst, and that was the goal. And the whole point is, as they do that, people see each other, they grow, you cross-pollinate, Instagram sees those interactions, it helps those networks grow, and then, of course, they move some of those people off to their Gab accounts or to their Telegram channels, right, where they can really give them the good stuff. And that's the problem. So one is that they don't adapt their rules enough. They're not nimble. And there's tons of examples where they have a rule in place. We're not going to allow bad things. They do one very small thing to get around it, and nothing changes. So one is that in the reporting system, I would say that it's important that the mechanism is adaptable to reality and is constantly evolving faster than these bad actors are. And that is definitely doable. They just don't. The second feature I would say is that they're going to have to start to think off-platform a lot more. And this is where what I was saying before comes into effect. Because oftentimes when we look down, look, there's a lot of bad reports. Anyone that's tried to organize anti-disinformation, misinformation stuff using very, careful volunteers, we realize that there's going to be a lot of false positives. That's not a reason not to do it, and that's not an excuse for the platforms. There are going to be people who just don't understand, who just see something they don't like and report it. Fine. Okay, but I think the second threat there, outside of the nimble part of the reporting piece, is to just emphasize that almost none of the platforms think about the ecosystem as a whole. And that is a big workaround. So for example, and I'll give one example of the reporting thing here. If I was the subject of a concerted harassment campaign, and I'm not going to mention the forum, that is solely designed to target individuals and you get points by getting them to, cry, hurt themselves, injure themselves, commit suicide. That's the goal of this big forum, and it's pretty well trafficked. But first you have to identify a target. How do you identify the target? So maybe you went on a bad date. Maybe you saw somebody going into a clinic, so you take a picture. Okay, let's find this person. How do they find them on these forums? They find them on Facebook, oftentimes. And there's actually a network of private groups that do nothing but help identify these people. They are part of this offline operation, but they do this work on Facebook. If I went to Facebook and reported it, it wouldn't be against the rules. But if I went to Facebook and reported it, it wouldn't be against the rules now. But it should be, because it's part of a concerted effort that's taking place off platform. So to just summarize, I would say the two biggest things, because obviously we can't fix it all, is one, there has to be some nimbleness in the actual reporting system itself so that they're evolving. The second is that they have to start looking at the threat holistically. Some reports are actually violating the terms of service when they think about how they're interacting with the types of operationalizing that's taking place off of Facebook.
Thanks so much, Angelo, for that. So Sophie, you're a data scientist. I'd love to hear from you on this too. What kind of innovations can happen in the complaint system? What kind of consumer protections ought to be more baked in to the systems?
Thank you very much. So I'm actually going to answer a similar but different question.
Please.
In that, I think my personal opinion is that the focus on reports and content takedowns is a misnomer, because the problem isn't that bad content appears on Facebook. Misinformation has always existed. 60 years ago, there was a conspiracy theory that fluoride in water was a communist plot to mind control people. But there were no mass mobs of people going out and shooting people for putting fluoride in water, at least I hope not. And I certainly wasn't around then. The difference is that the conspiracy theories are getting distribution now. The hateful people are getting distribution now. 60 years ago, they would 60 years ago they would be cranks hiding in basements. Now they have found each other and organized. We say that the Buffalo shooter was. Some people say he was a lone wolf, but he was supported by a community, online community of people who believed similarly and was hoping to achieve online fame similar to them. Because 60 years ago, what happened was, if you wanted attention, if you wanted to be heard by others, you had to be picked up by newspapers, in Congress, etc. And these acted as effective gatekeepers. Today, the gatekeepers are gone, and I think we're still grasping with what exactly that the consequence of that is. Because, like, people in the United States, people have an expectation of freedom of speech, that they are allowed to say things and it will stay up. But no one has the right to freedom of distribution. There's no right saying that everyone has the ability to testify in Congress. There simply aren't enough congressional sessions for that. At the end of the day, it's a fundamentally conservative idea that changes can be negative. That if you take away safeguards that were there previously, you can learn precisely why they were there in the first place. And I think we're grasping at that with that now. And so, rephrasing the question, I think the fundamental issue, like user reports and etc., they're focused on individual pieces of content or accounts that should be removed or etc. But that's never going to be a comprehensive solution. If nothing else, content will only be reported when people have seen it in the first place, and it will only be reported frequently when enough people have seen it for someone to report it. And fundamentally, the goal should rather be putting back some of those safeguards. And I mean, Francis has revealed that there were a number of proposals at Facebook to do that, but it wasn't in the company's interests to do so.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you so much, Sophie. I'm gonna come back to you, Marianne, but I want to get Rashad in here on this because I think he needs to leave in a few minutes. I know, Rashad, that you have a few ideas in terms of how to bake in more consumer protection and civil rights protections into the system. Can you share a bit about your thoughts on this?
Yes, and apologies for having to rush out. I think we changed the schedule just a little bit, and so it messed me up a little bit. But keeping it tight today. So, in the work that I've been doing over the last year in co-chairing the Aspen Commission's Institute on Information Disorder, and the report that we released that sort of, a number of people in this room and throughout government, civil society, tech platforms were all sort of involved at different levels, and people of different sort of political backgrounds as well. One thing that we really identified was sort of the kind of, one of the big things was around leadership missing across the board, right? Leadership from government, leadership from private institutions, leadership from media, leadership from civil society, and more leadership sort of moving us forward. And to sort of connect this to your question, which I think is important, is that when I think about sort of what is it going to take to actually get us to a place where we win more change, we actually have to raise the floor on what's acceptable and push up the ceiling on what's possible, and you don't do that simply by getting a policy that people believe in out in the world, because the technology moves so much quicker than the public policy making. And so if we don't actually build a cultural narrative around what actually needs to change, and we don't build a more sort of deeper understanding about what is unacceptable and what do we expect, then we're going to be playing whack-a-mole, that game at the carnival where something pops up and you hit it down. And even if we do get to a place where we move some legislation, we will quickly see that that legislation is meaningless the minute the ink dries, because everything moves so quickly. And even if you just use the platforms to try to turn out voters, you'll know how quickly things can change, and what you once thought was a sort of avenue to reach people no longer becomes an avenue. And so imagine if the ways in which you're paying the platform to use it shifts so quickly that when you're actually trying to hold it accountable, how quickly they will shift things. And so I think, as we think about this, what will it look like if we're, not just talking about the platforms, but we're holding accrediting institutions who accredit people as doctors and lawyers and academics accountable when people who are accredited actually are driving misinformation? What if we have more sort of public accounting and visibility for super spreaders of mis and disinformation? What if we have an accountability structure that is much broader than focusing on the platforms alone? And of course, we have to focus on the platforms, but we actually need an all of society sort of set of solutions. And then with that, we actually have to make investments beyond this, because this technology that can bring us into the future, that's dragging us into the past, is what we're dealing with now, but there will be other technologies over time. And so if we are not thinking about truth and reconciliation, and thinking about how do we build a shared story inside of a country that actually is trying to ban a full understanding of American history right now, all of those things are part of how we actually have to approach this problem. If we're simply thinking about this as technical solutions, and if we think about these as technical problems, we will actually miss what's really at stake, which is the sort of fundamental concept that a multiracial democracies can exist and flourish, where people come together. And in this country, people that come together who are ancestral strangers to try to make something work and try to work together to build something. And that is under contention. And so, when I think about sort of these issues, and I think about sort of how do we approach both the structures that we put in place at the platforms, I think about all of the ways in which we have to create a new incentive structure with larger society, a new willingness to make real demands, and build the level of demand that will make people expect and fight for what we deserve, and hold accountable those that stand in the way of that, whether they are business leaders, whether they are political leaders, whether they are media elites, whoever they are, that they will be seen on the outskirts. Otherwise, just like the way that racism works, which is a shapeshifter, racism is like water pouring over a floor with holes in it. It will always find the cracks. This is exactly what we are dealing with right now, and there will constantly be cracks, and we have to actually build a new floor if we actually want to move ourselves forward.
All right. Now, this is why Rashad is on TV all the time. I asked him how to fix technology, and he told us how to fix society to fix technology. So there you go. Dr. Franks?
Well, I think that the two things are really connected, right? How do you fix technology? How do you fix society? And a part of it is going back to something I mentioned before, which is the free speech question. The misunderstandings, the deliberate misinformation about the First Amendment, and the kind of just misunderstandings about what free speech is. There was a recent poll that showed that more than half of Americans believe that if a social media platform takes down your speech or bans a user, that they've engaged in some behavior that violates the First Amendment. That is a real indictment of constitutional literacy in this country, but it's also something that is being promoted by very prominent members of society, including many politicians. I mentioned Texas in passing, and it's worth dwelling on just for a moment to really talk about how wrong-headed this can get. If we're thinking about how to reform big tech and how to harness the newfound antagonism towards big tech, how badly that can go. HB 20, which was recently sort of allowed to go into effect, or arguably has gone into effect because of the Fifth Circuit, is a law that purports to take away social media platforms' right to take things down. So remember I mentioned before about how Section 230 has these two different parts. One is you get immunity if you leave stuff up, and the other one is you get immunity if you take stuff down. And this bill is aimed squarely at that second part, which not only is it a very reasonable and good policy to encourage companies to take things down, it also is really very much a reinforcement of the First Amendment. And even if Section 230 went away tomorrow, that would still exist. What do I mean? I mean the underappreciated element of the First Amendment, which is The idea that the government cannot restrict you from certain types of speech or restrict your speech, but private companies not only can, but should. That is the entire nature of private associations. There is not a place any of us could think of, whether it's a church or a restaurant or a university, where anybody can come in and say whatever they like, and there's no power on the part of the person in charge of that place to be able to eject that person under certain circumstances. That does not exist. Doesn't exist in the public square either. None of that is true. So the idea that we're forgetting about and that Texas gets so intentionally, perversely wrong is to take aim at the one thing that these social media companies have and have not used enough, which is their First Amendment right not to speak, not to promote certain information, not to associate with certain kinds of information. That's a First Amendment protected right on the part of these companies. HB 20, as many scholars have been pointing out, if read literally, would actually allow someone to sue over the taking down of the Buffalo shooting video. Think about that, right? That Twitch says we took it down. Facebook says we're trying to take it down everywhere we can, and now someone can sue and say you shouldn't do that. That violates freedom of expression, that's censorship. So really what that has done, that discourse about free speech has so confused us, and it really is, before I start to sound too sympathetic to the tech industry, hugely part of the problem that the tech industry itself has created. Because what did Facebook and Twitter and all of these companies say when they were getting going? We are free speech home, right? Come and share your speech here. That is where you're actually going to be able to speak without censorship. This was their line until very, very recently. They were trying to sell that to the American public. And why were they trying to sell it? Because they literally want to sell it. These companies don't create anything. They take your speech, our speech, and they sell it to data brokers. They get the two of you to fight. They get everybody to fight, and then they sell that. They create nothing. So they want you to believe that free speech means speaking on Twitter, speaking, and if you don't speak on Twitter, then did you really even speak? It's kind of a tree falling in the forest type of thing. And they've so managed to colonize Americans' imagination, and not just Americans, but we've now exported this, I think, quite heavily, to make people feel as though that's the only time they're speaking freely, and the moment someone restricts that speech, somehow that's engaged in censorship. So we need a reorientation of people's understanding of what free speech actually means. It includes things like the freedom to say that idea is garbage. That idea doesn't belong here. That's dumb. You're dumb. All of those things are things that we're allowed to say, right? Because we want there to be spaces where people sort content, where people curate, where people present what is best, what is intelligent, what is informed. We don't really want a bunch of spaces where people can say whatever they want in whatever context they want. And that's not even, by the way, something the First Amendment would protect, as I mentioned before. There's a very popular and completely wrong sort of competing statement. On the one hand, hate speech is not protected by the First Amendment. On the other hand, hate speech is protected by the First Amendment. Both of those are false, because hate speech doesn't really mean anything. In other words, we have to be very specific about what kind of speech we're talking about. That is, most people would agree that a racial slur is hate speech. Does that mean that if you are saying a racial slur on the street corner, you can go to jail? Probably not, because of the First Amendment. Can you use the same racial slur in the workplace? Probably not, because someone can actually sue you for that, and your employer can get sued for that. So the whole idea that there's this thing called hate speech that is either untouchable or completely censorable, that's just oversimplification, and it's distorting the debate. And at a minimum, none of these social media companies have any obligation to keep anything up. Just as Sophie was saying, it's not just that the user doesn't have the right of reach versus speech, but also these platforms have no obligation to do anything with your speech. They could, they might not, and as we know, according to their own rules, they keep up stuff and leave stuff off all the time. And when the Washington Post rejects my op-ed, they're not censoring me either, right? They have no obligation to engage in my speech or to promote my speech, nor do any of these companies. So a huge part of the demand has to be to try to take out what the tech industry has done to our brains when it comes to free speech, and think about all the ways in which we can actually use free speech in ways that are good for society, good for intellectual discourse, good for debate, and not assume that things that can be monetized on Twitter are the be-all and end-all of what free speech is, and not let that run the terms of the conversation.
Thanks, Marianne. I can't imagine the Washington Post declining your op-ed. Go on. Before we ask the last question, I just want to talk a little bit about the work that Jessica and I and some of the groups here also have done with Change the Terms, to suggest people have a look. We're involved in a campaign that's really centered around fears about the election, which is coming up here. Of course, There are issues across the world, as Maria Reza talked about this morning, with elections in multiple places. And what we're asking for from Change the Terms in our Fix the Feed campaign is to get the algorithm straightened out somehow, right? To stop this process of just feeding more incendiary and increasingly incendiary information to people. This radicalization process that we saw play itself out in Buffalo is the end result of that. And there'll be more if these things aren't fixed. The second thing is to protect all people the same. In other words, no carve-outs for influencer speech, no carve-outs for newsworthiness. What I write online should be moderated the same way as what Donald Trump writes online or anybody else. As long as we leave those gaps, we let the most powerful people in terms of reach put out the most incendiary messages. And we need to remember this is about all languages. Sadly, we're in a situation where tech companies maybe moderate English in the United States, but the further and further you get from Silicon Valley, and non-English languages are frankly a mess. Jessica's done a ton of work, Media Matters has, on Spanish language content here in the United States, which is a problem. My organization has done work on conversion therapy in Swahili in Kenya, and you cannot believe how horrifying it is. So it's just, the further you get, the worse it gets. And finally, what we call show us the receipts. Give us the proof of what you've done. No more empty promises, no more hidden things, no more inadequate transparency reports. Do something, concrete. So I just want to ask one last question before we wrap up. With the elections coming, the midterms here in the United States, what is the most important thing that needs to happen with the platforms? Let's start with you, Angelo, if you have thoughts on that.
Gosh, I would say the single most important thing is private and closed groups. Power is being organized on the fringes, and all the other stuff that we're talking about, that's long form, big structural changes, that's like the fire code, but right now the house is on fire, so we gotta put it out first. And one of the big flashpoints for that are these private and closed groups, because they operationalize a lot of offline harms, but also are sort of important and critical nodes for distributing some of the most damaging disinformation and misinformation. So I would say there's almost no enforcement there when it comes to the worst stuff, and that's a pretty much universal thing. So I would say right out of the gate, that's it.
Sophie, you probably have thoughts on this since you dealt specifically with inauthentic actors in elections.
Yeah. So this is a bit of a weird question because there's no chance of our proposals actually being implemented. It's like asking if the sky could be any color that you wanted, what color would you want it to be?
That's right. We still want to see what color you want it to be.
Yes. Okay. And so this is a conversation largely about online harms and misinformation, which is separate from inauthentic behavior again. And my proposal, hence, would be to take away the reshare button. Perhaps regulation that makes it illegal, perhaps the companies doing it voluntarily by Mark Zuckerberg having a stroke and becoming a different person overnight. Who knows? I mean, this is not going to happen, but I think it would do. But like I said, fundamentally, the problem is not that content is being created. The problem is the distribution. And 10 years ago, with the Arab Spring, we were idealists about the free distribution of information. But today, we've increasingly realized that that the gatekeepers previously existed for a reason.
Man.
Well, one of the hardest things about that question is that, as I think many of the panelists have echoed already, is that when we're trying to figure out what would be the best steps for the platforms to take, the people who can answer that are the people inside those platforms. It's not any of us, actually. By design, it's not any of us because we don't know what's going on there. And when it comes to the question of, well, how do you make sure, for instance, that another insurrection isn't planned on Facebook, right? The best person to answer that are people inside Facebook who saw the first one and ignored all the warnings that they were getting about what was happening and made those decisions. So I'm back to what I would say before, though, which is right now they don't have incentives to think differently about that. So if we could, in fact, snap our fingers and get Section 230 reform that made them have to calculate, well, if we do this wrong, if we make the wrong call here, there might actually be consequences, not just a few hours of feeling uncomfortable by getting some questions from some members of Congress, but actually we might get sued. We might get sued a lot, in fact. The only person who can really make that decision, right, is going to be the person who knows, here's the tool that I'm thinking about using. Here's the function that I think I'm going to continue. Here's the potential harm that's going to come of it. Now, in the way that it has worked up to this point is, so what if a lot of harm does come of it? I'm off the hook. That's a classic moral hazard, right? The externalities of my negative actions don't hurt anybody except for people who are not me. And so that's going to put that person in a very strange position. Now, if we say to that person, you might actually suffer the consequences of making the wrong choice here, they might actually make the right one. But this is part of the game that the industry wants to play, which is, oh, come up with a better solution. Why don't you come up with a way to regulate us? What we really need to do is have a really strong lever, legislatively and otherwise, that says, no, if you don't come up with the right way to do this, we will actually be able to punish you for it, because that's how law works. That's how a society works, and you should not be exempt from that.
Let me ask you actually in that frame about what the Congresswoman was talking about earlier and sort of this idea of having a digital agency. I wonder if any of you all have thoughts. You probably do, I'm assuming. It's your sort of bread and butter.
You mean digital agency devoted just to
Yeah,
this
to
question?
yes, what she laid out is basically a regulatory body within the FTC to handle this.
You know, I think all of these things are potentially good, right? I think that all of these things that do more to re-examine the tech industry's current status quo, those are all good. I do keep coming back to the question of incentives, and I come back to this question that again, if we were all thinking about this ourselves, if we knew that we could possibly get regulated at some point by some procedures later on by an agency that might look at us, we might change our behavior. If we knew that we were about to get sued because we made a mistake, we might change our behavior today. And so as much as I support, these things do not have to be mutually exclusive, and I do support these very thoughtful reforms and these dedicated resources people want to put in these places, but I really do think that this is a human behavior question. And the human behavior is, you're going to keep pursuing this thing that benefits you until it doesn't benefit you anymore. So if it benefits you now in a way that is unfair and bad for society, stop letting that happen.
Any thoughts, Angelo?
I mean, look, I like the idea. I think it's important to have some experts in space. I realize what usually ends up happening. The industry ends up controlling it. And even if that's not the case, I still think that we are really on the cusp of an authoritarian takeover. The engine of that power being organized are the platforms right now. So I'm terrified about the idea of creating any kind of structure that gives the next wave of government more power to work the refs at the platforms. The right did a very, very, very good job of working the refs in the newsrooms 20 years ago, inside the social media companies 7 years ago. If they had real functional power to do that at the tech level, I don't know how we ever unwind that. So big picture, I love it, but I also think we just have to be really realistic about where we are in this moment. And I'm just not sure I want to give the next authoritarian regime any power unless we have a little bit more certainty about where we're headed.
Fair enough. Yeah, we have to
Sorry, I'm a
create
bummer.
rules that we can live with if scary people get elected to office, because that's where we are right now. Well, I want to thank all the panelists, Rashad, Marianne, Sophie, Angelo, my co-chair here, Heidi. But I also really want to extend warm thanks to CCDH and Imran and your team. It's really lovely to be here in person, scaring the crap out of each other. And I'm really looking forward to the solutions panel. Ball's in your court.